This video is part of a series with a theme of PTSD, and this part discusses one of my resources that has been useful in the past couple of years, which is Audible. And I'll just explain how it's been useful, why, and go into some of the details. So the first thing is I've had a duality of tension, which consists of, on the one hand, wanting to do something immediately, but on the other hand, being too impatient and excitable to be able to sit down, and the need to kind of burn off restless energy. And so in this context, consuming new information was important to feel like I was learning. I actually learned about what trauma and PTSD were on Audible. I learned it by talking to a young man in a cafe at a time I was going through an enormous amount of trauma, but didn't have a name for it or an ability to understand it. And since Audible was the way that I was able to digest and respond to a lot of information when I was too restless to sit down and read, I think it's useful as both a medium and also as a source of good information. So I'm going to scroll down and look through the chapters that have been, or the books that have been useful to me. One of the last books useful is The Gifts of Imperfection. I learned about Brené Brown in her TED Talk on vulnerability and have found it useful to consume most of her books that are available on Audible. They're just intelligent reaffirmations of what I already knew, which was that part of my craziness and part of my sickness and the difficulty of getting healthy in America has to do with the fact that the really important conversations about what's going on emotionally and in our inner world are largely taboo, particularly for men. This trip will change your life. A shaman's story of spirit evolution. I've found the general shamanic focus to be useful because a lot of what goes on in trauma is not in this reality. And what a shaman is a bridger between the unseen reality and the seen reality. And as a result, shamans in our culture experience some of the same prejudices and dismissals and shames, etc., as people with PTSD do. They're both misunderstood. They're both dealing with realities that are very real but are somewhat invisible. And so that one was, I guess, just comforting, I would say. Just go through 5 weeks in the Amazon. One of the things that I find is that some psychedelic experiences validate experiences that I have in this culture with PTSD and give people the courage to talk about it. And so I experienced that reading This book's 5 Weeks in the Amazon, which is largely about an American man going in and reconnecting with himself on ayahuasca. Really enjoyed this book, A Shaman's Miraculous Tools. One of the things that I deal with on PTSD with PTSD is profound irritability around the different corporate runarounds that go on in our culture, and setting the table, the transforming power of hospitality. It's just very satisfying to see hospitality, which is kind of the opposite. It's about making an emotional connection with every guest and human being and establishing an environment of welcome. And so there's aspects of that have been satisfying. The body keeps the score. I was a little bit intimidated by the main book at first, so I read this little 30-page or 30-minute book, and that encouraged me to read the rest. This Michael Palin book tied in with teams, a book on teams I was reading that talked about the way that many teams that don't really like each other, and Monty Python fit into that category to some degree, do exceptional work together, and explained why. When the body says no is part of a score of books that have been really useful because it ties together the latest neuroscience on the body and the wisdom of the body. And one of the things that I discovered in trauma is that my inability to read, listen to, and respond and respect my body is one of the biggest frustrations and blind spots that, along with several other books, it's just very satisfying to dive into all of the different areas that our body is communicating to us and being disrespected by the culture, by ourselves, and learn from it. So I put a fair amount of weight on the value, and I listened to that book several times. Adrenal fatigue is an important subcategory of when, the way I see it is that rage, terror, helplessness, shame, and consequent hate are the core diseases, emotional diseases, that when untreated erupt into violence, that in an unsafe and violent culture and a dissociated culture become PTSD, as opposed to just short-term trauma that gets repaired and healed. It locks in at the brain that it's never really safe, and it has not cleared out of the system. That's when it gets locked in parts of the brain and the body as PTSD. Once PTSD develops to the fullest extent that it does, it then starts to create a number of ripple effects. One of them being adrenal fatigue, which is often synonymous with chronic fatigue. I've had chronic fatigue, and it's grown slowly, and it comes from so many small things producing this high unanswerable anxiety that doesn't ever fully cessate, because as soon as I'm done with one thing and I can breathe for a few moments, it's like, well, what about this and what about that? And when in the condition of PTSD, peak emotional stress and distress is locked in place as if it's happening in the present, and then the brain finds any little small threat out in the current reality and projects that that's the cause of the PTSD, because we have this amazing rational brain that if we're feeling intense terror, the brain says, okay, we're irrational. That means there is something intensely terrifying in the reality. And then it goes out and finds something that's mildly bothersome and projects that this is actually the cause of the intense terror. And it's how and why people with PTSD, quote, overreact, meaning to someone who isn't experiencing the internal reality of terror, their reaction is about 10 times excessive. It's about something, it's just 10 times excessive. But to the person experiencing the intense terror, it often, in the illusion of the moment, makes sense to them why they are so upset about this little detail. But in my case, what often happens is I'm aware that it is a 10 times, I'm overreacting by a factor of 10, but the emotions are so strong, it doesn't affect the reaction. It just makes me feel shitty that I'm reacting 10 times more than I think I would if I wasn't feeling so much terror. So, and that in and of itself creates another anxiety about like, oh, I'm overreacting. This is going to create problems. And so adrenal fatigue and chronic fatigue become kind of co-symptoms or co-diseases in the same way that people rarely die from pneumonia. They die from all the complications of pneumonia reducing their immune system, and then some other little thing like a cold takes them out. One of the interesting things on a biographical level is one can see mental disease playing out in a whole variety of leadership and celebrity roles in business, in the media, etc. And that's certainly the case with Walt Disney. The Power of Vulnerability, Daring Greatly, important books on shame, which needs to be understood as part of the healing process of PTSD. Ever so often, it's fun to just escape with something like The Never-Ending Story. Some of these I dipped into and dipped out of and didn't find quite as useful, and so I'm kind of skipping over some of that. It is sometimes healthy and helpful to give a mythological context to some of these things, because if you look through the biography of gods and goddesses, what you tend to find is amplifications of human archetypes. And because mental and emotional illness has been around for a long time, you will find plenty of, quote, deities that are infected with rage, narcissism, self-importance, jealousy, bitterness, lust, creativity, revenge, etc. And as archetypes, they're able to serve as lighthouses to recognize these parts within ourselves, because ultimately all the gods and goddesses are projections on a big scale of who we are at the time that we create the mythology. The Body Keeps the Score is the single most useful, beautiful, wide-sweeping look at childhood abuse that erupts into a whole host of symptoms, one of them being PTSD, trauma, and then PTSD. But it looks at it on a very human level. And the author has been involved for over 40 years, starting with working with the Veterans Administration at a time when they were in deep denial of PTSD, and then going on to leaving that because of the denial, and playing a participatory role in it entering the lingo and even being given a name. So Bessel is one of the leaders in the field. He's very well respected among psychiatrists, psychotherapists, trauma specialists. Everyone that's really good in the field knows him and loves him. And so I highly recommend that as an overview. The Body Never Lies by Alice Miller is a window into understanding a piece of PTSD and a piece of shame and taboo, because what she basically focuses on head-on is the fourth commandment, thou shalt love thy parents, which of all the commandments, this is a commandment to feel something, to feel love, to have a feeling. And what she points out is that human beings are wired to love anyone who is close to them, who respects them, who is kind, who is supportive, and who is known to them. It is human nature to love people that are lovable. Someone who's lovable is in relationship, is in proximity, is respectful to is respectful to you and respectful of who you are and are becoming, is safe, is compassionate and understanding, is intimate. You see them, you understand one another. It is human nature to love any human being in that state, just as it is human nature to hate anyone who terrifies you, induces states of trauma through violence, through threats, through shame, through ostracization, through insanity, who humiliates you, who shames you in public, who induces profound loneliness and violation with physical violence. When that is combined with the powerlessness of a very small child being terrorized by their parents, it is human nature to feel hate, because hate is a natural emotion when one is powerless and terrified and being hurt by the very people supposed to protect you and who you are dependent on. It's a human emotion. And she also talks about the way that all human emotions are held in the body, and draws a lot of correlation between different forms of illness and disease and lies or illnesses in the mind, i.e., if we've been hurt and are terrified and truly feel loathing or hate or hurt or panic and terror around parents that have abused us, and it's been locked in the body in a place of trauma, we can get physically sick by pretending or glossing over all of that and dedicating ourselves to, for example, living the lives our parents want us to live. So it's a really great, candid look at the fallacy of the fourth commandment on the basis that one cannot command a feeling. In other words, I can put a gun to your head and I can say, do this or I'll shoot you. And you can do it or not do it, but threat and terror can induce an action. However, threat and terror cannot induce love. You cannot feel love in the same moment you feel terrified and helpless to anyone, let alone parents, when you're 2 feet tall and they are in comparison 30 feet tall. So this is just a wake-up call that the shame and guilt that's been hurled at us for not loving our abusers and feeling fond when we're in terror and in shame and in trauma is actually a psychological absurdity, and it's important to break down. So I found that to be a very useful book. Again, I listened to it several times, and it stimulated a number of very healthy conversations with my lover at the time, because she would talk about some of the things that I could see that I might be having this influence on my lover. I could check in with her, I could apologize, and then I could have the conversation with her. And so that was a great book. Healing Trauma by Peter Levine was the first book. That was the book that I downloaded when I was in a cafe. I had not even finished listening to the benefits of healing trauma and what trauma was before I had got out my phone, clicked the Audible app, and clicked download. And as a summary, I have about 500 books in my Audible library, and I've fully listened to over 450 and perused each one. And I fully listened to Healing Trauma within 3 days, doing a number of the exercises. And to me, that's the power of the Audible app, because even if I'd ordered the book on Amazon and it arrived 3 days later, that would have been 2 days too late to really respond to some of what was going on. And then I wouldn't have read it 4 hours a day the way I listen to it 4 hours a day. I can listen when I'm cooking. I can listen while I'm eating. I can listen if I'm restless in bed and not falling asleep at low volume and put on the sleep timer. I can listen when I get up in the morning, when I'm brushing my teeth. So I can consume audiobooks easily 4 hours a day if something is time sensitive and important. It's hard to find 30 minutes to read in a day, or in times of agitation, times when I have 30 minutes to listen. I'm just going to scroll back and look at some of the other things. The Science of Trust is just good context and important skills. People with PTSD often have very traumatic, turbulent relationships. So the more one can study about relationship, the better. There's lots of things that may or may not give you some clue, like Man's Search for Meaning. There's incredible trauma about being in a concentration camp. And there's also interest in how some people survive that and some people don't, and why. Well, being in child abuse, which develops into PTSD, where you have parts of you living that horror for a lifetime, is being in a concentration camp. And we all have to figure out, are we going to be one of the survivors? Getting the Love You Want fits into that category. What Makes Love Last? Some people may experience PTSD around UFO type phenomena, one way or another. The secrecy around it, the insanity of seeing something and be told you don't, etc., etc. And so this book, UFOs, is looks at some of the governments that are taking a more open mind, and like the French are the leaders in owning and actually documenting what's going on. The US has long had a shame and discredit, which may for some people be one of the causes of stress and or trauma, is that one has had a frightening event, and then your own government takes an active step in shaming and making out that you're insane, because that's one of the important strategies the US government has adopted to discredit anything while they do a very serious investigation themselves. I'm not quite sure what they think they're accomplishing by humiliating and shaming a noticeable percentage of the population, but that is what they have decided to do. Being with Dying is a lovely, it's a lovely book, and it's I think people with enough terror, enough shame, enough thoughts of suicide, etc., have a little bit more openness and interest in the sincerity and honesty of people close to death and what their experience is. And these books here, I really liked Life Lessons with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and The Wheel of Life. Found that incredibly, that to be an incredibly useful book. But I also really like The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences. Because here's another overlap. One of the interesting things is that because out-of-body spiritual transcendent experiences are a function of dissociation with the body, and because trauma involves the safety mechanism of dissociation, there's a certain overlap between people who, while being raped, while being brutalized, have transcendent moments because they're in a dissociative state. And so it's valuable to kind of piece together that no, the bliss wasn't being beaten. The bliss was the fact that having been knocked out by being beaten, one is in a certain state of consciousness that many monks and people of faith have accessed through chanting, through dancing, and that kind of thing. And so it's important, I think, for people with trauma to understand the terrain of spirituality, near-death experiences, altered states, etc., because trauma is an altered state. I also think that it's one of the bridges of healing. And what I mean by that is there's an incredible amount of pain that is inherently linked with trauma and PTSD. There is an optional or a potential of some good coming out of it. And I think a lot of that potential lies in the realm of near-death experiences, altered states, understanding them, and building the experience, like everyone who's been traumatized and had altered states on a repeated basis, everyone who's learned how to distinguish between past reality and present reality is actually in some way training to be a shaman, which is not someone with long hair and feathers. It's someone who is versed in an unseen world that most people can't see, that part of what they can see, and the seen world, and is able to shepherd or ferry people back and forth so that they can start seeing what's a little bit fuzzy in their consciousness, but that is there waiting to be seen. That is all that a shaman is. And people with trauma can experience that or can play a part in that, as can, so shamans can do that. And people who have experienced trauma have almost always experienced altered states. Those altered states may just be hell, misery, and timeless horror, but those are the same type of dimensions that are also, when flipped, become timeless and expansive and or unconditional love or unconditional bliss. And that's when you've broken into the territory on the pain side, it's a little bit easier to access the territory on a joy side. And one of the ways that I relate to that is the ease with which a number of lovers who have experienced trauma have, through sexuality, entered profound altered states that I suspect they first became familiar with on the pain side. It's kind of like a map or a region in the self within which one either experiences timeless terror, timeless horror, timeless grief, or timeless joy, timeless love, but it's the same type of timeless terrain. On the psychedelic side, the transpersonal vision, Stanislav Grof, who has a very strange aside, was actually one of my clients, has the most extensive legal background in the exploration of LSD before it became illegal. He was actually brought to the United States because he was an expert in LSD from Russia and given permission to do great work in one of America's leading hospitals before the government took a U-turn and decided to keep using it and experiment in the military, etc., undercover, but not actually honor or let any therapists do that. And so that talks a little bit about that. Rick Strassman, explores that in the context of DMT, dimethyltryptophan. Let's have a look here. By the way, the part of me that is frozen, at about 5 years old or whatever, just loves fairy tales, and so that's what some of this is kind of occasional comfort and pleasure and innocent delight in simple things. Elon Musk is one of my heroes, and certainly traumatized in many ways as a child. And it's also interesting to see how that has given him here's an interesting phenomenon. I met a veteran with PTSD who is at times suicidal. He had read every book in the library. Elon Musk, when he was very young, was severely abused as a child, so his PTSD happened young. He read every book in his library and actually started requesting more books in the library just so he could read them. He would wander into bookstores and go into this zoned-in trance where nothing would exist except the book he was reading. And he's now using that same dissociation from what anyone else thinks to have supreme confidence in his vision and bring it to life And so he's got superactive parts of his brain and other parts that are not at all responsive to other people, that are dissociative and or, quote, sociopathic. And he's using that very positively to achieve a superhuman level of technological advance. In 3 major industries, he's playing a huge role. And so that's an interesting, I guess, success story. He's also absolutely miserable as an adult at times. He just is not focused on how he feels. He's focused on his goals. They're loading slowly, and can't remember. Happiness by design. That can't have been that significant. $1 Billion Painter. That definitely Thomas Kincaid's ups and downs, and there's definitely mental sickness in that story. This is an interesting, was blind, but now I see. It's just a enjoyable biography about being totally helpless and just the terrain of going from fame and success into helplessness and regaining that with the help of technology. Acid Test is a significant book because I've always been terrified of being out of control, and so I've avoided all alcohol and all recreational drugs my entire life. Never been drunk, never taken a drug, never wanted to. But as part of my last suicide wave, where I was considering, basically I'm in pain, I don't want to live another 40 years like this, which means I've either got to come up with some basis to make an intelligent hypothesis about how the next 40 years could be emotionally healthy, or it does not make sense from an experiential side to live. Meaning I don't feel like I owe it to anyone to live. And so, if I could be out of pain in another location or dust, depending on what you believe in, that's an intelligent choice. Now, that led me to consider psychedelics as the one frontier of medicine and human experience that I had not tried. And Acid Test turns out to be largely not about LSD, but about the approved protocols for treating Iraqi veterans on MDMA. And so that led me to both successfully and very unsuccessfully test MDMA on those protocols. I say successfully because there's definitely a liberating experience to experience myself without fear and without the need to control, and to realize what I would be if I was not on, if I was not on, quote, PTSD, all the chemicals and compulsions and things about that. So it's a real glimmer into health. I also had a therapist abuse the romantic sexual relationship while on MDMA, which is a bonding drug, and then abandoned me in the most painful way. So it's really unfortunate that these drugs are not made legal, because it adds in this whole element of fear and terror and panic around people's career, which often leads them to be inhumane because their reputation or their job and their legality is on the line. and not receive as much training and education because it can't be talked about. So I really feel that our government's ban on drugs has not only, empowered crime across the world. In the books that I've read, that seems to be the case. And by banning the healthy use of documented and tests on psychedelics for therapeutic purposes, it's just set the whole area of research back decades and spent trillions of our tax dollars doing it and locking up a lot of the population in prison in traumatic ways. And it's just good to have a window into what's going on there. Food for the Gods also softened me to the positive possibilities of some psychedelics and made a strong link between the founding of most of the major religions concurrent with the finding of certain substances at that time. So that was an interesting overview. Quiet is a really great book for sensitive people. But Bold by Peter Diamandis and several other books such as The Future is Better Than You Think, I would say played a very powerful role in helping me understand that a lot of my impression that the world is going to hell is media created and an illusion that is not backed up by statistics. It's a very, very uplifting book in that it looks at long-term trends over the history of humanity and projections of the future based on those trends, and talks about just how great our reality is in a number of areas and getting better, including things that I didn't know. For example, that per capita, there has never been less violence than there has been today. Listen to the media, it's always like in these troubled times in these days. It's actually less per capita than it's ever been. So we're becoming more and more conscious and more upset by the violence that is there, but per capita on a global level, it's going down. So there's some great statistics and science there. Healing back pain, this talks about the way that emotional pain is often translated into back pain that moves around and can't really be healed surgically. A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. I think it helps us understand some of the outrage, because one of the ways I think we get tricked into feeling crazy is by just blacking out half of the reality that totally coincides with our feelings and pretending it doesn't exist. And we do that in our history books for sure. And it kind of is useful to remember where trauma may have come from generationally. Fun book about heroes and myths again. I like things like the Sword of Shanran stuff. I find that sometimes, because the imaginal realm can be a powerful tool of healing trauma. I learned that when I started writing poetry in my teens. It can give insight to some of the inner realities by just imagining that all that's real happening on the inside, and what would it imply as a way of relating to certain fears and fantasies, etc. In other words, if there's this horrible demon in a fantasy book and it's killed with fire and a sword, and you have this feeling of horrible something or other inside, maybe taking fire and a sword and banishing it from one's inner state works. If it does, great. The book's giving you an idea. If it doesn't, who cares? It's still fun entertainment. Get Abundance is a great book. And then some of these other books have been useful in making money to do the other things. For example, I've spent 7 months focused on trauma and healing and understanding it this last year, but it was partly paid for by this book, The One Thing. I read the book, thought it was a good idea, did the exercise, decided that making a new ideal website would be the one thing that could pivot my reality the most. It's a landscape website, Mystical Landscapes. And I asked my assistant to give me a list of the top 100 landscapers in the country. So he spent a few days putting that list together. The ones that had won the most awards, that were the most knowledgeable, that were the biggest landscape companies. And then I asked him to select the 100 best websites from all those companies and send them to me. And then I went through and I picked my favorite website of the best. And then I got my assistant to train and build me a better one of that. And sales doubled. And so, you know, the idea is basically when you're going under and you've got way too many problems to solve them all, you focus on the one thing that if you get that right will get you out of all the other things. In other words, there's a lot of problems that can't be solved with money, but there are a lot of problems that can. And so probably tripling the quality of my website and then doubling the work that came in gave me twice as much money to do a lot of other things and solve a lot of problems that could be solved with money. Zero to One by Peter Thiel. I love it. It's an important area of just distinguishing wealth. A lot of these success and stuff books gave me small ideas that had useful stuff, which I applied. The singularity is an important, just philosophical thing that also can give some hope and some concern about why it might be worthwhile to hang around for another 30 years, even if at this particular moment things look pretty dim. Embracing the Wide Sky, A Tour Across the Horizons of the Mind. I like that book. Synesthesia, and he's a savant, so again, some of us who are, you know, responding to our various coping mechanisms around trauma, explore parts of our brain that most people haven't, and it's fun to hear language put to that exploration. Asperger's book, 600 Hours of Edward. The Introvert Advantage, a good book, particularly if you're shy and somewhat collapsed by shame due to PTSD. This was, I spent several years starting an online business because I was panicked that all my adrenal fatigue had already taken 80% of my energy, and I was panicked that in a couple of years I would not be able to do my work at all. And then, so I felt like I had to keep ahead of the curve and not end up poor in America, since to have the shame of being considered a loser piled on top of all the other shames of PTSD, etc., I thought would be just too miserable to want to live. However, it ended up being a $100,000 mistake, meaning I spent 4 hours a day for 2 years pouring time, creativity, energy, and money into how to get rich quick online, and found that it was the biggest expense and waste of energy of my entire life. So I just went back to being a service provider and doubled my income using the website thing I mentioned. Crucial Conversations is a nice book. I really liked A Global Life about the fellow at the World Bank. It's a nice biography. Martha Stewart, I think, has some PTSD, and yeah, it was. I think it's sorry for her that she's a woman. If she was a man, she's kind of like Donald Trump, and so she'd be, and she's a bit more polite, and so she would be easily perhaps president material, but with our chauvinism, she's just considered, someone to criticize. Christian Dior has a wonderful biography of finding a way to be successfully feminine, and greatly supported. I guess partly because he's gay. Far from the Tree by Andrew Solomon talks a lot about minorities and the various brutal prejudices that exist. So it's a very valuable book in that area, and just giving context so that we don't feel that we're singled out for shame, humiliation, abandonment, and abuse. It's really minorities on all levels, and it's why advocating for minorities, I think, is very important for all of us. Flourish. The areas of positive psychology, I think, are quite important. Ted Turner suffered a fair amount of PTSD, addiction, and stuff, but found a way to make that work for him. As did Ping Fu, one of the more successful women company owners. Warren Buffett experienced a lot of trauma, and This is not the biography. It's Warren Buffett and the Business of Life. This is that book, Abundance, The Future is Better Than You Think. It's amazing. These Harvard Business Reviews, they're wonderful. There are a lot of the case studies that someone pays $50,000 or more to go to Harvard for, and they're $2 a piece, so they're really great. This book, Free, by Chris Anderson, I thought was a good book. It got me thinking in a number of ways. The Righteous Mind, I thought was a great book by Jonathan Haidt. The Happiness Hypothesis, also a very good book. Grunge of Giants about Buckminster Fuller. It was definitely out there, and I think he gets a lot of credit, and so it's nice to see how out there some people are who get a lot of credit for doing all kinds of things, including inventing the geodesic dome. The Snowball by Alice Schroeder. Warren Buffett, one of the richest and most successful investors of all time, used his high focusing ability and shyness and all that to become the greatest investor. And it's wonderful to see there are paradigms of turning the states of the states of this into something that's really great. And I'm not finding Sonia Lyubomirsky's books. I wonder if I only could read those, but they were very helpful, and maybe I only found them on Kindle. So anyway, that is some of the reading that has been most useful as companion, as affirming of sanity, and the like. And I hope it helps you.